The first time the Duke of Ashford heard his bride described as the most wretched creature in the empire, he exhaled for the first time in 3 years, because a man cannot fall in love with a monster, and Darrell G. Fujita had decided long before the ink dried on the contract that he could not afford to feel anything ever again. Hello, my golden-hearted wanderer. As the sun dips low, painting the sky in hues of buried treasure, pause and whisper to me, where does your evening light fade tonight? From the bustling pulse of Lagos markets, the storied whispers of Virginia's old estates, the fog-kissed peaks of Scotland, or under starlit expanses in Australia, Texas, or Toronto? Drop it in the comments below. I cherish every word, turning our tales into a tapestry woven by you. If these slow-burn romances of veiled passions and golden longings stir your soul, hit that like, subscribe to Hearts Buried in Gold, and let's unearth more together. Now lean close. The candles of St. George's Church burned like accusations. Darrell G. Fujita, the 8th Duke of Ashford, stood at the altar with the posture of a condemned soldier, spine straight, jaw locked, eyes fixed on the great arched doors at the far end of the nave, as though sheer aristocratic will could make this moment end faster. Around him, London's finest had packed themselves into the gilded pews like crows settling onto a fence, powdered, perfumed, and ravenous for spectacle. He could feel their collective gaze pressing into his back like a blade. They had all come to watch the great Ashford name finally kneel, not to God, not to the crown, but to a merchant's ledger. He told himself it didn't matter. The debt his father had carved into the Ashford legacy was a wound too deep to survive on pride alone. 3 years of quiet hemorrhaging, tenant farms abandoned, the East Wing shuttered against the cold, staff dismissed with hollow apologies and hollower coins, had stripped every illusion from him. He was not a duke today. He was a transaction, and the currency being exchanged was a ring, a name, and a lifetime of carefully constructed indifference. The rumours about Laura S. Cremians had reached him, as all rumours do in London, through a chain of whispered amusements at his club. Terrible to look at, hidden from society since her coming out. Her own father keeps her veiled in public, poor man. Darrell had listened, said nothing, and quietly allowed the gossip to
calcify into relief. A wife he could never love was a wife who could never destroy him. The ugliest girl in the empire was, in that singular, brutal sense, the safest woman in England for a man who had sworn himself to stone. The organ groaned to life. The congregation shifted, that electric, collective inhale that moves through a crowd when a curtain is about to rise. Darrell straightened further, if such a thing was possible, and turned toward the aisle. She came slowly. He registered the veil first, heavy, layered lace, almost architectural in its density, cascading from the crown of her dark hair to the tips of her white-gloved fingers. It moved like something alive, rippling faintly with each measured step. Her chin was lifted. That, he noticed with a flicker of something he could not name. Her chin, held at an angle that was not the posture of a woman being led to the altar, but of a woman arriving at a battlefield she had already scouted. Behind her, in the third row, a woman in a gold gown, sharp-eyed, lips slightly parted, leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made the woman beside her press a hand to her mouth in shock. Darrell did not look at them. He looked at the veil. And for the first time since the contract had been signed, the first fracture split clean through his carefully constructed certainty, because something about the way Laura S. Cremines walked toward him, something in the unhurried, almost deliberate rhythm of her steps, suggested that she was not afraid of this moment. She was waiting for it. His hand was steady as he reached for the lace. His pulse was not. The heavy veil lifted. The candlelight struck her face like a confession. Dark hair, freckled skin, and eyes the precise colour of a sea before a storm, wide and gleaming, and wet with tears she refused to let fall. She was not ugly. She was not hidden. She was stunning, in the specific, dangerous way of a woman who has learned exactly how much power her beauty carries, and chosen, until this precise moment,
to keep it locked in a box beneath 7 layers of rumour and lace. Her lips parted. And in the half-second before the congregation erupted around them, before the gasps and the whispers, and Kathleen W. Bandy's sharp intake of breath cut through the organ's final note, Laura S. Cremines looked directly into the Duke of Ashford's eyes and smiled the smile of a woman who had just won the opening move of a very long game. He had lifted her veil. She had been counting on it.
The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Darrell had always considered the most dishonest day of the week. Too far from the weekend to carry hope, too close to Monday to pretend the week had not already begun its slow collapse. He read it standing up, because sitting felt like surrender. The numbers were not new. He had memorized them months ago the way a man memorizes the dimensions of a wound, not because the knowledge healed anything, but because ignorance was a luxury he could no longer afford. £47,000. The figure his father, the 7th Duke of Ashford, had managed to bury in bad investments, worse card tables, and a string of private debts so tangled that Darrell's solicitor had needed 3 separate candles and an entire Tuesday afternoon just to trace their roots. £47,000. And the creditor were no longer sending polite letters. They were sending men. He set the paper on his father's desk. His desk now, though it still smelled of the old Duke's pipe tobacco and catastrophic optimism, and walked to the window. The Ashford grounds stretched before him in the grey morning light, the south lawn gone patchy and pale, the fountain dry and silted at its base, the tenant cottages along the eastern lane wearing their disrepair with the quiet dignity of things that have been forgotten rather than abandoned. His people, his responsibility. Children he had watched grow up running barefoot through those fields were now going to sleep on half rations because their Duke's father had mistaken luck for strategy and a card table for a throne room. The knock at the study door was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Mr. Hartley is here, Your Grace." Darrell did not turn from the window immediately. He allowed himself 3 more seconds of the grey lawn, the dry fountain, the silent evidence of everything his father had hollowed out. And then he turned.
Edmund Hartley entered the study the way money always enters a room, ahead of itself, filling the space before the body arrives. He was a broad, self-assembled man, the kind who had built his fortune with both hands and wanted you to know it without him having to say so directly. He wore no title. He needed none. Into the chair across the desk without being invited. "I'll be brief." "Please." Darrell sat. He folded his hands. He kept his face exactly as he had trained it. Still water. No surface movement. Nothing for a man like Hartley to read or use. "My daughter Laura requires a husband of standing." Hartley placed a single document on the desk between them. Thick, already signed on his end, the ink dried and final as a verdict. "You require capital. I am proposing we resolve both problems in a single arrangement." The fire in the grate clicked and settled. Darrell looked at the document. He thought of the dry fountain, the patchy lawn, the children on half rations in the eastern lane. Then he picked up the pen.
St. George's Church had never been a kind place. It was magnificent, certainly. The vaulted ceilings, the columns rising like frozen prayers toward heaven, the candlelight that turned every gilded surface into something that approximated holiness without quite achieving it. But magnificence and kindness were different currencies, and London society had always been far more fluent in the former. The pews were packed this morning, with people who had not come to witness a sacrament. They had come to watch a man bleed with his chin up and call it a wedding. Darrell knew this. He had always known this. He stood at the altar in his finest dark coat, the one that had belonged to his grandfather, altered twice and still fit like an argument, and he let the knowledge settle over him like armor. Let them watch. Let them whisper behind their programs and their gloved hands and their carefully arranged expressions of polite concern. He had been performing dignity for 3 years, in rooms full of people who expected him to crumble. He was very good at it by now. The church smelled of beeswax and old stone, and the particular floral excess of a ceremony assembled to impress rather than to move.
He did not look at the congregation, but he felt them. In the third row on the left, Kathleen W. Bandy had positioned herself with the strategic precision of a woman who understood that the best view of a disaster was never from the back. She sat straight-spined in a gown the color of old gold, her dark eyes moving across the altar with the calm, assessing patience of someone who had already decided what she thought and was simply waiting for the event to confirm it. She had been among the first to circulate the whispers about Laura Cremines, not maliciously, she would have insisted, but informatively, which was how London always laundered its cruelty into something socially acceptable. Beside her, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat leaned close and murmured something. Kathleen did not respond. She simply watched the altar with a faint, satisfied stillness, as though she had placed a private wager and was very confident of the outcome. The organ began. The sound filled the church from the floor upward, pressing against the stone and the gilt, and the 200 assembled witnesses who straightened collectively, instinctively, the way people do when performance demands their attention. Darrell felt his jaw tighten by a fraction. Only a fraction. He would not give this crowd the theatre of watching him break composure at the sound of a wedding march. He fixed his eyes on the great doors at the far end of the nave. They opened slowly, the way significant things always do, as though the moment itself understood its own weight and refused to be rushed. The congregation exhaled as one, and then she appeared at the threshold, and every whispered cruelty Darrell had taken comfort in, every useful rumor he had stored against his heart like a shield, began quietly and without warning to lose its footing. She was moving toward him through the candlelight, her veil heavy, her chin lifted, and the whole church leaning forward at once, not in sympathy, but in hunger, waiting to see what happened when the Duke of Ashford finally knelt to a merchant's coin. He had not knelt yet, but the doors were closed behind her now, and there was no direction left in the world except forward.
About the sacred and binding nature of what was being assembled here, in this candlelit theatre, before 200 people who had come dressed in their finest hypocrisy. He nodded at the appropriate intervals. He had always been disciplined that way. The ability to perform function while the mind worked separately, quietly, behind the composed facade, like a second room nobody was invited into. But the woman beside him was making the second room very difficult to maintain. She had not looked at him since taking her place at the altar, not once. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, her veil cascading in heavy, layered silence around her, and she looked straight ahead at the priest with an attention that seemed almost deliberate, too deliberate. The kind of focused stillness that is not calm, but rather the precise management of something that is not calm at all. He had seen that particular quality of composure before, mostly in men who were outnumbered and had decided not to show it. It unsettled him more than tears would have. "Your Grace." The priest's pause carried the gentle but unmistakable weight of a prompt. The congregation leaned forward by a collective half-inch. This was the moment, the lace, the face beneath it, the great ugly revelation that 200 people had arranged their Tuesday morning around witnessing. Darrell reached for the veil. The lace was heavier than he expected, thick and intricate, embroidered with small flowers that caught the candlelight as he lifted it, as though even the fabric was performing. He raised it slowly, and the air between them shifted the way air shifts before a storm announces itself, that charged, breathless second when the atmosphere knows something the ground does not yet. Then the candlelight struck her face, and Darrell G. Fujita, the 8th Duke of Ashford, a man who had in 3 years of financial catastrophe not flinched at a single creditor's threat, a single society sneer, or a single predatory letter from a single predatory solicitor, felt the breath leave his body as though something had taken it. She was not ugly. She was not plain, not unfortunate, not the wretched secret London had been passing around its drawing rooms like a cautionary tale for 3 seasons. She was devastatingly, almost aggressively beautiful,
dark hair pinned loosely at her crown with small strands escaping at her temples, freckles scattered across pale skin with the casual precision of something that hadn't tried and hadn't needed to. Her eyes, when they finally moved from the priest to his face, with a particular grey blue of deep water before weather, wide, luminous, and filled with tears that had not yet decided whether to fall. The congregation erupted in a silence louder than noise, that specific electric hush of 200 people inhaling at precisely the same moment and forgetting to exhale. Darryl could not move. Her lips parted, barely, just enough, and she leaned the smallest fraction closer, so that what she said next arrived only for him, wrapped in the scent of winter roses and carried on a breath so controlled it could only have been rehearsed. "You should have asked to see me first, Your Grace." The tears balanced at the edge of her lashes but did not fall. Her expression did not waver. "You will spend the rest of your life regretting that you didn't." The organ resumed. The priest continued. And Darryl stood at the altar of St. George's Church with the heavy lace veil still raised in his hand, looking at a woman he had never prepared for, understanding with the cold, sinking clarity of a man who has just misread every card in his hand that he had walked into something he did not yet have the vocabulary to name. Behind them both, in the third pew, Kathleen Bull Bandy pressed 2 fingers to her lips and said nothing at all. She didn't need to.
The priest said the words that mattered. Darryl said his portion of them back, cleanly, without hesitation, in the voice he reserved for things that required the appearance of certainty, whether or not the substance of it was present. Laura said hers in a tone so steady it bordered on unsettling, each syllable placed with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had memorized long before the occasion demanded it. Not from nervousness, from precision. There was a difference, and standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin through the cold church air, Darryl was beginning to understand that with Laura S. Cremens, the difference between those two things would always matter enormously. The ring went onto her finger without incident. He had chosen it weeks ago from a tray his solicitor had arranged without sentiment, a simple gold band, appropriate, impersonal, the kind of ring that fulfilled its contractual obligation without making any additional promises. He had been quietly pleased with it at the time. Looking at it now on her hand, against her pale skin, it struck him suddenly as a very small thing in a situation that was becoming very large. "You may kiss the bride." The congregation stirred, that soft collective repositioning of 200 people leaning forward in unison, the way a tide moves toward shore, not because any single wave decides to, but because the whole body of water is pulled by something larger than individual intention. Darryl turned to her. Laura turned to him at precisely the same moment, and something in the synchronicity of it, the way they moved together like two people who had rehearsed this without ever having met, sent a quiet, unnameable current through his chest that he immediately filed under things to examine later and never examine again. He leaned forward. She rose, fractionally, to meet him. The kiss was brief, correct, entirely appropriate for a church full of witnesses, and a marriage that was, at its foundation, a financial instrument dressed in lace and candlelight. And in the precise half-second that their lips met, he felt it. A small, folded pressure, paper, stiff and deliberate, pressed from her gloved fingers into his palm with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this before, or had at minimum rehearsed it enough times that the execution was flawless. His hand closed around it on instinct, fingers folding inward before his mind had fully processed the instruction, the way the body sometimes responds to danger before the brain has finished reading the situation. He pulled back. She was already looking forward, serene and composed, her hands folded again at her waist, as though nothing had passed between them except the kiss the priest had sanctioned and the vows the church had witnessed. 200 people applauded. Darryl stood at the altar of St. George's with a secret note burning in his closed fist like a coal, and looked at the profile of his brand-new wife, the clean line of her jaw, the particular stillness of her expression, the tears that had never fallen, and felt the entire architecture of the morning rearrange itself around a single, cold, clarifying thought. He had walked in here believing he was the one making a purchase. The note in his hand suggested otherwise. He did not open it in the church. He would not give these pews, these candles, these 200 sharp-eyed witnesses the satisfaction of watching his face change. Whatever was written on that paper, and something in the controlled elegance of how it had been delivered told him it would be significant.
It would wait until the carriage doors closed behind them and London's finest had been left behind with their programs and their gossip and their gold-gowned observers. But his thumb moved once across the folded edge of it, slowly, the way a man traces the outline of something he cannot yet bring himself to open. Beside him, not looking at him, Laura S. Cremens, the Duchess of Ashford as of 40 seconds ago, allowed herself the smallest possible smile, just enough for no one to see, except perhaps for Kathleen W. Bandy, whose sharp eyes saw most things, and who leaned back in her pew for the first time all morning with the quiet, satisfied exhale of a woman whose wager had just paid out beyond expectation.
The carriage door had not fully closed before Darrell opened the note. He had waited precisely that long, the duration of the final handshakes, the rice thrown by hands he didn't see, the coachman's click and the lurch of wheels finding their rhythm on the cobblestones, and not a single second longer. Laura sat across from him in the dim interior, her veil finally pushed back from her face, her hands arranged in her lap with that same unnerving composure that had characterized every moment of the last 2 hours. She did not watch him unfold the paper. She watched the window instead, the grey London streets sliding past in the pale afternoon light, as though the note and its contents were a matter of only passing interest to her. He unfolded it with both hands. The handwriting was precise, small, controlled letters marching across the page in clean, even lines, the penmanship of a woman who had been taught that presentation was its own form of argument, and had taken the lesson further than her tutors had intended. He read it once. Then he read it again, more slowly, the way a man rereads something not because he failed to understand it the first time, but because understanding it the first time had not yet produced the appropriate response in his body, and he was hoping the second pass might help. It did not help. The private clause was 4 sentences long. It had been drafted, the note explained, by Laura's personal solicitor, not her father's, her own, retained independently at 17 years old from her own carefully accumulated allowance, and inserted into the marriage contract during the 3rd revision, nested between 2 subsections of financial language dense enough that a man reading quickly, or a man reading with the assumption that the document contained no surprises because he was the one with all the power, would move past it without pause. Darrell had read quickly. Darrell had assumed. The clause was elegant in its brutality. In the event that the Duke of Ashford chose to conceal his wife from society, to keep her at the estate, to restrict her movements, to deny her the public presence befitting her title, full discretionary control of the remaining Ashford liquid assets would transfer immediately and legally to the Duchess, not to her father, not to a trustee, to Laura herself directly and entirely, with no recourse and no appeal. He lowered the paper. Laura was still watching the window. "You had this written before you met me," he said. It was not a question. 3 months before the contract was drawn. She did not turn from the glass. "I needed to know that whatever happened after the wedding, I would not simply disappear into the countryside and become another secret a powerful man kept for his own convenience." The carriage rolled on. A wheel found a rough patch of road, and the whole frame shuddered briefly, then steadied. "You let your father negotiate as though he held all the terms," Darrell said. "My father believed he did." Now she turned from the window, and the pale afternoon light fell across her face cleanly, without the mediation of lace or candlelight, or the performance of a church full of witnesses. She looked, in this undecorated moment, younger and harder simultaneously, the specific combination of youth and resolve that belongs to people who have been afraid for a long time and have made something useful out of it. Darrell looked down at the note again, then at his wife. "The ugly rumors," he said slowly. "You started them yourself." Something moved across her expression, not quite a smile, not quite pain, but the particular territory that exists between the two when a truth has been carried alone for long enough that speaking it aloud produces both relief and grief simultaneously. "I needed a husband who would not look too closely," she said, "and I needed a reason for the right kind of man to refuse me." The right kind of man. James Rafferty, she said the name the way people say the names of weather systems, not with emotion, but with the flat factual gravity of something that causes damage as a matter of its own nature. He had already decided I was going to be his. The rumors were the only wall I could build quickly enough. Outside, London thinned and gave way to open road. The horses found their pace. The grey sky pressed low at Ehan over the fields, sliding past the window, and the interior of the carriage held its silence for a long moment. Not the silence of 2 strangers, but the more complicated silence of 2 people who have just been forced to see each other clearly and are still deciding what to do with what they found. Darrell folded the note. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it with deliberate care into the inner pocket of his coat, directly over his chest, where it sat with the quiet, settled weight of a thing that had permanently altered the landscape of everything that came after it. "You bought me," he said quietly, not with anger, with the particular tone of a man updating his understanding of a situation he had badly misread. Laura turned back to the window.
"I survived you," she said. "There is a difference, Your Grace. I suspect you will come to appreciate it." The carriage rolled north towards Ashford, and neither of them spoke again for a very long time.
The rain found them somewhere past the 3rd milestone. It arrived without theatre, no preliminary wind, no dramatic darkening of the sky, simply a quiet insistence against the carriage roof that built gradually from suggestion to certainty, the way some threats do. Laura watched it streak the window glass in thin, crooked lines and said nothing for a long while. Neither did Darrell. He had learned in the past 2 hours that silence with this woman was not absence, it was preparation. When she finally spoke, she did not look at him. I was 19 the first time James Rafferty decided I belonged to him. The words landed in the carriage interior with a flatness that was more disturbing than any dramatic delivery could have been. Not the flatness of someone who felt nothing, but the flatness of someone who had told this story to themselves so many times in private that all the sharp edges had been worn smooth through repetition, leaving only the shape of the thing behind. Darrell did not move. He had learned, in rooms full of men who needed managing, that the most useful thing a person can sometimes do is become very still and take up very little air. "The rumor was my architect's solution," Laura said. "I could not make Rafferty uninterested in my father's money. I could not make my father choose me over his contracts cleanly and without cost. But I could make myself." She turned from the window then and looked at Darrell directly, with eyes that had stopped being careful, worthless to a man who only wanted a beautiful acquisition. The logic of it settled over him slowly, the way cold water settles, first the surface, then deeper, then bone. "You made yourself ugly," he said, to a man who only valued beauty. "I made myself a rumor," she corrected quietly. "There is a significant difference. A plain face can still be managed, still be presented, still be argued into usefulness by a determined man with social leverage, but a secret, a deformity whispered about in clubs and drawing rooms, something shameful the father is said to hide." She shook her head slightly. "Rafferty could not acquire reliability. His entire social architecture depends on being seen to possess beautiful, enviable things. A disfigured wife would have been a crack in his foundation he could not afford. So he stepped back." "He stepped back," Laura confirmed, "and began waiting for the rumor to collapse. He has been waiting and watching and positioning himself for the moment the story fell apart, and I became retrievable." She said the word as though it tasted of something unpleasant. Today was that moment. A public unveiling before 200 witnesses was always going to be. He knew I could not remain veiled forever. The carriage hit a rough stretch of road. The interior swayed as steadied. "He was at the church," Darrell said. It was not a question either. He had seen, in the far left corner of the nave, a figure he had not recognized, and had not thought to question. Tall, still, positioned not in a pew, but standing at the periphery, like a man attending not as a guest, but as an assessor. In the back, Laura's hands tightened once in her lap, then deliberately relaxed. "He now knows that I am married, that the rumor is finished, and that his window—" She paused, something moving behind her eyes that she did not quite succeed in smoothing away— "is not closed, not yet, only relocated." The word hung in the rain-filled quiet between them. Darrell looked at his wife, this woman he had signed a contract for, this woman who had outmaneuvered him before he had learned her name, this woman who had built an elaborate architecture of self-protection out of the only materials society had left available to her, and felt the last of his carefully maintained indifference begin, quietly and without his permission, to come apart at its seams. "He will come to Ashford," Darrell said. Laura met his eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said simply, "he will." Outside, the rain fell steadily on the open road, and the horses carried them north through the grey afternoon towards a manor that had not yet decided whether it was a refuge or a trap. Ashford Manor announced itself the way old things announce themselves, not with drama, but with the quiet, accumulated weight of having existed long enough to stop needing to impress anyone. It emerged from the tree line as the carriage rounded the final bend of the northern road, sitting low and broad against the darkening sky, its stone facade the particular grey of things that have weathered generations of English weather and simply absorbed them, taken them in like everything else, and remained. The east wing was visibly shuttered, windows blank as closed eyes, the ivy along its face grown unchecked and slightly wild. The fountain at the center of the approach was dry, its basin collecting dead leaves in a patient, undramatic way that was somehow worse than visible damage. It simply looked like a place that had stopped expecting good news. Darrell watched Laura take it in through the carriage window. He was aware he was watching her, and aware that he was doing it in the specific way of a man who tells himself he is simply gathering information, while the more honest part of him admits he is looking for something he cannot yet name. Her expression, as Ashford revealed itself stone by stone through the glass, was not what he expected. There was no polite concealment of disappointment, no carefully arranged neutrality of the kind society women deployed when confronted with something below their expectations. She simply looked, steadily, thoroughly, the way she seemed to do most things, as though she was not seeing the disrepair, but the structure beneath it, calculating not what was broken, but what remained sound enough to build from. The carriage stopped. The staff had assembled on the front steps in the thin, apologetic line of a household that knew itself reduced, 7 where there had once been 30, their uniforms pressed with a dignity that cost them something, standing in the grey afternoon with the careful posture of people determined not to be pitied. Mrs. Alderton, the housekeeper, stood at their head, a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 60, with the bearing of someone who had kept this house alive on sheer will and a reduced budget, and intended to keep doing so until someone told her otherwise, or she died, whichever came second. Darrell descended first. He turned to hand Laura down. She stepped from the carriage, looked at the assembled staff for one quiet moment, and then did something he had not anticipated. She walked directly to Mrs. Alderton. Not to the center of the steps, not to the position of arrival that protocol suggested and social training demanded, directly to the housekeeper, with the purposeful, unhurried stride of a woman who had already decided that the most important person on these steps was not the one standing at the top of them. Mrs. Alderton, Laura took the older woman's hand in both of hers, not the glancing social touch of a duchess acknowledging staff, but a firm, genuine hold, brief and warm. I have heard that you have kept this house standing through considerable difficulty. I want you to know that I consider that a form of loyalty that outranks most things I have encountered today, and I do not intend to take it for granted. Mrs. Alderton blinked. It was the smallest possible blink, a single fractional interruption in the composure of a woman who prided herself on being uninterruptible, but Darrell caught it, and suspected it cost the housekeeper more to produce than she would ever admit. "Your Grace," Mrs. Alderton said, with a warmth that had not been present in her voice in quite some time. Laura moved along the line then, unhurried, present, speaking to each member of staff by name. She had learned them, Darrell realized slowly. Somehow, between the contract and the church and the carriage and the note and everything else she had been managing simultaneously, she had learned the names of every person standing on these steps. The young footman, Thomas, who straightened almost imperceptibly when she addressed him directly. The kitchen maid, Agnes, whose eyes went bright with something close to surprise. The elderly groundskeeper at the end of the line who had worked Ashford for 40 years, and who, when Laura paused before him and said simply, "The grounds have been beautifully maintained under impossible conditions," pressed his lips together and looked away briefly at the tree line. Darrell stood at the base of the steps and watched his wife take his house. Not aggressively, not with the sharp territorial efficiency of someone claiming a prize, but with the quiet, natural authority of someone who understood that a household is not a building, but a collection of people, and that the fastest way to earn the loyalty of people who have been forgotten is to remember them first. Mrs. Alderton fell into step beside Laura as they moved towards the entrance, already speaking in the low, rapid, practical tones of a woman who had been waiting for someone worth briefing. Laura listened with her head slightly inclined, asking questions that were direct and sensible, and that clearly surprised the housekeeper with their precision. Darrell followed them inside. The entrance hall was cold and slightly dim, 2 of its wall sockets dark for want of candles. Laura paused in the center of it, looked up at the ceiling, around at the walls, and then turned to Mrs. Alderton with an expression of complete, unperformed calm. "Show me the household accounts," she said, "all of them, tonight." Mrs. Alderton looked briefly, involuntarily, at Darrell. He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and because some part of him, the part that had been carrying the weight of this crumbling house alone for 3 years, felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular unfamiliar sensation of a burden being shared by hands steady enough to hold it. He looked away from his housekeeper and walked deeper into the cold, quiet manor. Behind him, Laura S. Creemans, the Duchess of Ashford, his wife of 6 hours, began, with steady and unhurried purpose, to take the house apart and put it back together properly. The message arrived at breakfast. Not a letter, a card. Thick cream stock, the edges beveled with the particular precision of a man who understood that presentation was its own form of intimidation. The handwriting was bold and unhurried, the script of someone accustomed to correspondence that did not require a response so much as compliance. It had been delivered not through the post, but by a private rider who, according to Thomas the footman, had handed it over at the gate with the relaxed confidence of a man who expected the gate to open wider for him next time. Darrell read it once at the head of the breakfast table. Then he set it face down beside his cup, with the careful, deliberate placement of a man who does not want the object in his hand any more, but intends to deal with it thoroughly before the morning is finished. Across the table, Laura watched him do this and said nothing. She had learned in 3 days at Ashford to read the specific vocabulary of his silences, and this one, she understood, was not the silence of a man deciding whether to act, but of a man deciding how. "Rafferty," she said. "Not a question. He intends to call this afternoon." Darrell lifted his coffee. "He frames it as a social courtesy, a neighborly welcome to the district." He paused. "He is not a neighbor. His nearest property is 40 miles south." "He has taken a house in the village," Laura said quietly. "He would have arranged it before the wedding. He plans carefully, and he moves quickly once he has committed to a direction." Darrell set down his cup. He looked at his wife across the breakfast things, the thin morning light falling across her face, her hands wrapped around her own cup with a steadiness that he now understood was not the absence of fear, but the very disciplined management of it, and something cold and clarifying moved through him, cleaning out the last traces of the detachment he had arrived at this marriage wearing like armor. He pushed back from the table and stood. "Mrs. Alderton." The housekeeper appeared in the doorway with the promptness of a woman who had been running a house long enough to know when a morning was changing its nature. "Close the front gates and bolt them. Tell Jenkins to post himself at the eastern boundary. Rafferty will have noted the gap in the hedgerow from the road, and a man like him files that kind of information." He moved to the window, scanning the grounds with the efficient, systematic attention of someone conducting an inventory. "I want Thomas at the front door and no one admitted without my direct instruction. Not a rider, not a card, not a verbal message delivered with a smile." Mrs. Alderton absorbed this without expression. "And if he arrives regardless, Your Grace, then he will find the gate locked, the door closed, and the Duke of Ashford standing behind both of them." He turned from the window, which is a considerably different welcome than he is expecting. Mrs. Alderton allowed herself the smallest nod, just a fraction, crisp and satisfied, and disappeared. Darrell crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the room and pulled 2 sheets of paper from the drawer. The first he addressed to his solicitor in London, laying out in precise, unhurried language the details of the private clause, the Rafferty situation, and the specific legal protections he required drawn up and delivered by the week's end. The second he addressed to a man he had served beside briefly in his younger years, a man who now moved in the kind of circles that knew where bodies were buried, sometimes literally, and who owed Darrell a favor of the sort that never expired. He sealed both letters and handed them to Thomas personally. "Ride to the village and post these yourself," he said. "Do not stop on the way and do not speak about their contents to anyone." Thomas, to his credit, simply nodded and left at pace. Darrell returned to the breakfast room. Laura had not moved from her chair, but the cup was set down now and she was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something open and unguarded, a brief interruption in the composed self-sufficiency she wore habitually as her clothing, as though what she had just witnessed had reached past the careful architecture of her defenses before she had thought to close the door. "You believe me," she said. It came out quieter than she had clearly intended, carrying the particular weight of words that have been held back long enough to become something more than their surface meaning. "About Rafferty, about what he is." Darrell looked at her steadily. "I believed you in the carriage," he said. "I have simply been deciding since then what believing you required of me." She held his gaze for a moment. Then something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but settling, the way a held breath finally releases when the boy accepts that the air is safe. Outside, he heard the heavy iron gates of Ashford Manor swing shut, and the bolt drive home with a sound like a full stop placed at the end of a sentence that had been left hanging too long. The house locked itself around them both. In the village 4 miles south, James M. Rafferty would be receiving no answer to his card. He was a man unaccustomed to silence from people he considered already decided. Darrell understood with the cold, clear certainty of a man who had spent 3 years learning to fight with nothing, that silence would not hold Rafferty for long, but it would hold him long enough. He pulled a chair from the wall, positioned it squarely between the window and the door, and sat down to wait with the particular, settled patience of a man who has stopped running, and chosen for the first time to stand his ground on ground that has finally begun to feel like his own.
Rafferty came at 4 o'clock. Not through the gate. The gate was bolted and Jenkins was at the eastern boundary, and Thomas was at the front door with the particular expressionless solidity of a young man who has been given clear instructions and intends to honor them completely. Rafferty came through the village road on a horse too fine for the countryside, and with 2 men flanking him who were not servants in any domestic sense of the word, pulling up at the Ashford gates with the unhurried ease of someone who has decided in advance that whatever obstacle presents itself will be temporary. Darrell was already outside.
He had heard the hooves on the approach road while Rafferty was still a silhouette between the tree line, and he had walked out through the front door and down the steps and across the gravel with the same steady, deliberate pace he had used at the altar, spine straight, jaw set, the face of a man who has made a decision and is simply now arriving at its location. He stopped at the gate. Rafferty drew up on the other side of the iron bars and looked at him with the particular expression of a man recalibrating, not alarmed, but adjusting, the way a hunter adjusts when the animal he has been tracking turns around to face him, and he realizes for the first time that the dynamic of the pursuit has quietly changed. He was handsome in the way that certain dangerous things are handsome, clean-featured, well-constructed, wearing his confidence like a second coat over his first. His eyes were pale and very steady, and moved from Darrell's face to the manor behind him and back again, with an assessing patience that confirmed everything Laura had said in the carriage. Ashford. His voice was pleasant, sociable, the voice of a man at a club, not a man at a locked gate. I had hoped for a warmer welcome. I come as a friend. You come as a trespasser, Darrell said, pleasantly, with the same sociable tone returned and emptied entirely of its warmth. These are private grounds. That is a locked gate, and I did not invite you. Rafferty's smile adjusted by a fraction. I have known your wife since she was 19 years old. I think some acknowledgement of prior acquaintance is not unreasonable. My wife, Darrell said, with a quiet and absolute emphasis on both words, has expressed no desire to renew that acquaintance. Her position on the matter is the only position that concerns me. Something moved behind Rafferty's pale eyes, not anger yet, but its immediate neighbor. She is a remarkable woman. I have always thought so. I would simply like the opportunity to... No. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It landed in the afternoon air between them with the finality of something structural, a door not merely closed but removed from its hinges so that the question of opening it could not arise again. Rafferty looked at him for a long moment. The two men flanking him had not moved, but their stillness had changed quality, the difference between men at rest and men awaiting instruction. Darrell noted this without allowing it to alter anything in his own posture. You don't know what you have involved yourself in, Rafferty said. The pleasantness was largely gone now. What remained was quieter and considerably more honest. I know exactly what I have involved myself in, Darrell said. I have involved myself in my marriage, on my land, behind my gate, defending my wife from a man who has confused persistence for entitlement for long enough that the distinction has ceased to exist for him. He took one step closer to the iron bars, close enough that the space between them became deliberate. My solicitor has a full account of your conduct towards the Duchess over the past 3 years. My correspondence this morning ensures that account is now in several other hands as well, hands belonging to people whose opinion of you has professional and social consequences you would find significantly unpleasant. He paused. Leave Ashford. Leave this county. Do not send cards. Do not send riders. Do not position yourself in villages 4 miles from this house and call it coincidence. We are finished here. The afternoon held its breath. Rafferty looked at the gate, at the manor, at Darrell's face, in that order. Then he pulled his horse back from the bars in a single, controlled movement, turned without another word, and rode back down the approach road with his 2 men behind him, still unhurried, still composed, because a man like Rafferty would not give the satisfaction of a visible retreat, even when retreating. Darrell watched until the hoofbeats faded entirely into the tree line. Then he turned and walked back to the house. Laura was in the library. He found her standing at the window that overlooked the front approach, which meant she had watched all of it, the arrival, the conversation, the departure, from behind the glass in the particular silence of a woman who has spent 3 years managing her own survival alone, and is still, even now, in the process of learning what it feels like to have someone stand at the gate instead of her. She did not turn when he entered. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, looking out at the empty approach road, the closed gate, the dry fountain catching the last of the afternoon light in its silted basin. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Darrell said, "He will not come back." "You cannot know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know the letters I sent this morning will make the cost of coming back considerably higher than he is willing to pay. Men like Rafferty are brave in proportion to their confidence that consequences will not arrive. I have introduced the possibility of consequences." He paused. "He will recalibrate." Laura was quiet for another moment. Then, very quietly, "You did not have to do that." "I am aware. The contract does not require it. The clause does not require it. Nothing you signed obligates you to..." "Laura." He said her name, her given name, for the first time, without the formal architecture of title or surname, and she stopped. He turned from the window to face her, and she turned to face him, and the library held them both in the grey late afternoon light with the stillness of a room that understood something was happening in it that mattered. "I did not do it because of the contract." She looked at him with those storm-grey eyes that had first struck him at the altar like something he hadn't braced for, and in them he could see the specific, careful watchfulness of a woman deciding whether to believe something she very much wants to be true and has been burned enough times to approach with caution. He did not look away. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "I came to this marriage looking for a transaction.
I brought you to a crumbling house and a reduced staff and a dry fountain, and I told myself that was sufficient because the contract said it was sufficient, and I had decided not to feel anything that the contract didn't require. He stopped, steadied.
The next part cost him something, and he did not try to pretend otherwise. I was wrong, not about the debt or the house or the terms, about you. I had decided what you were before I had the honesty to look, and you deserved better than that from the beginning. Laura said nothing, but something in her face had changed. The watchfulness still present, but altered, the caution softening at its edges into something more complicated and considerably more vulnerable. I am not asking you to forget the clause, he said. Keep it. It was the right thing to write and the right thing to hide, and I mean that with irony. But I am asking you, he paused once more, finding the words with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not say important things carelessly, to stay, not as a bargain, not as a transaction or a solution or a purchased arrangement that suited both parties in a church on a Tuesday. He held her gaze, as my wife, as an equal, as the person who walked into my crumbling house and learned the names of my staff and asked for the household accounts on the first night and made Mrs. Alderton look at the tree line so nobody would see her eyes go bright. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same quiet territory. I would like to build something with you, if you are willing. The library was very still. Outside, the last light of the afternoon was settling over the Ashford grounds, the patchy lawn, the dry fountain, the east wing with its blank shuttered windows, laying gold across all of it with the impartial, unhurried generosity of light that does not distinguish between the broken and the whole. Laura looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the small pocket of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper, different from the first note, smaller, without the legal precision of the carriage document. She held it out to him. He took it, unfolded it. 3 words in the same small, controlled handwriting. I already am. He looked up from the paper. She was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, open and unguarded and almost unbearably honest, the face beneath all the faces, the one that existed before society and rumor and survival strategies and heavy lace veils had made their various demands on it. He folded the note once and placed it in his breast pocket, beside the first one. Then Darrell G. Fujita, the 8th Duke of Ashford, who had stood at an altar 6 days ago, braced for a transaction and armored against feeling anything that the contract did not specifically require, took one step towards his wife and offered her his hand, not to lead her anywhere, but simply open, simply present, the gesture of a man who has put down something heavy and is showing that his hands are free. Laura S. Cremans, the Duchess of Ashford, looked at the offered hand. Then she placed hers in it. Outside, the dry fountain caught the last of the evening light and held it, briefly, like something beginning. And so, my golden-hearted wanderer, the dry fountain holds its first light, and 2 broken, brilliant people hold each other. Tell me, did this story find the tender, guarded place in your chest where you keep the things you're afraid to want? Drop your heart in the comments below, whether you're sighing under the Largo sky, wrapped in a Scottish mist, or watching stars spill over Texas fields. Every word you leave becomes part of our golden tapestry. If slow burn love that earns every heartbeat moves your soul, like this story, subscribe to Hearts Buried in Gold, and stay close, because the next tale is already whispering your name.